If you were to ask any children's Bible class who was the strongest man in the Bible, the children would likely answer Samson. Most of us know about Samson and his great strength. I remember those Bible stories from my childhood. Physical strength stands out in Samson's story. At Ashkelon, he killed 30 Philistines. At Timnah, he caught 300 foxes, set their tails on fire, and burned up the crops of the Philistines. At Lehi, he killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. The Philistines wanted to ambush Samson at Gaza when they saw him visit a prostitute. In the middle of the night, he got up to leave the city. When he arrived at the city gates, he found them locked or at least closed. To escape the Philistine ambush, Samson grabbed the gates, removed them, along with the post from the wall, and carried them to the top of the hill outside of Hebron. At the end of his life, Samson pushed the pillars out from under the temple of Dagon, killing himself and a multitude of Philistines. All of these events indicate the mighty physical strength of Samson. When we think of Samson and his conflicts with the Philistines, weakness is the last thing that comes to our minds. When we look deeper into the man himself, Samson is seen to be a very weak man. Weaknesses of character plagued Samson. One of his weaknesses was a selfish heart. Before Samson, there had been 5 judges who had delivered God's people from oppression and given them relief for a considerable length of time. Onathiel gave the people relief from the oppression of Mesopotamia, and the land had rest for 40 years. Ehud delivered them from the Moabites, and the land had rest for 80 years. Deborah destroyed the oppressing Canaanites, and the land had rest for 40 years. Gideon eliminated the Midianite oppression, and the country was in quietness for 40 years. When Jephthah was through with the Ammonites, the children of Ammon were subdued before Israel. These judges were victorious through the strength God gave them. Well, Samson was given similar strength. God helped him when he was confronted by a lion, chapter 14, verse 6, and Isai fought the Philistines. But a common thread runs throughout the stories of Samson's power. On each occasion, Samson appears to use his God-given abilities to benefit himself. Once he delivered himself from the Philistines, he stopped. He was a constant thorn in the side of the Philistines, but he never completely relieved the persecution of God's people. During his 20-year judgeship, the Philistines continued to rule over God's people, not until the days of David's reign in Israel, were the Philistines finally subdued by God's people. Samson seems to be more interested in using his God-given abilities for personal gain than for divine glory. We see that Samson had a misplaced trust. In Judges chapter 16, Samson became involved with Delilah, a woman who got him into trouble. He met her in the valley of Sorek, chapter 16, verse 4, which begins about 12 miles west of Jerusalem and winds its way northwest to the Philistine coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Once Samson fell in love with this woman, the Philistines saw an opportunity to destroy him. The lords of the Philistines came up together with a proposition, chapter 16, verse 5. They proposed that if Delilah would discover the secret of his great strength, each of them would give her 1,100 pieces of silver. Thus the Philistines offered Delilah a sizable bribe to betray Samson. Well, Delilah went right to work, nagging Samson to reveal the secret of his strength. He toyed with her by saying to her that if he were bound by 7 green bowstrings, his strength would vanish. That evening, while he was asleep, she tied his hands with the bowstrings, and awakened him with the cry that the Philistines were upon them. Samson arose, broke the bowstrings, and chased the Philistines away. Delilah accused Samson of being unfaithful to her because he had lied to her about the bowstrings. Do you see a couple of problems here in this relationship? Samson lied to her. She was trying to give him over to the Philistines. Well, that wasn't the only time that happened. She illustrated that the best defense is a good offense. Rather than defending what she had done and binding Samson, she confronted him about his lie. Well, Samson responded by telling her another lie. He said that if he were bound by new ropes that had never been used, his strength would become like that of other men. Well, that evening, Delilah tied Samson up with the new ropes while he slept and awakened him by screaming that the Philistines were approaching. Again, Samson arose, broke the ropes, and put the Philistines to flight. Delilah complained about Samson's dishonesty again and urged him to tell her the truth. Well, Samson should have realized what she was trying to do. After a few more days of her nagging, Samson told her another lie by saying that if his hair was braided into 7 locks, he would lose his strength. Again, Delilah webbed his hair together and awakened him. As at other times, Samson arose and chased the Philistines away. Well, this time, Delilah's nagging reached the extreme. She nagged so much that Samson was annoyed to death. Chapter 16, verse 16. And the record says that he told her all that was in his heart. He said, "If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me." Now, before Samson was ever born, his mother had taken the Nazirite vow. And for Samson, he was never to cut his hair in his entire lifetime. So he says, "If my hair is cut, my strength will leave me." Well, predictably, Delilah sent for the Philistines, who came while Samson was sleeping. Samson was one sound sleeper. Amen. When they were through, they cut his hair, shaved off the locks of hair. They brought the promised reward money to Delilah. Delilah awakened Samson, crying that the Philistines were upon them. Well, he once again arose, expecting to chase them away, only to find that the Lord had departed from him. Chapter 16, verse 20. Sad words. The Lord had departed from him. The Philistines tied him up, put out his eyes, and paraded him to Gaza. No doubt this was done in revenge for the humiliation he had given the city when he tore off their gate and carried it away. Well, once in Gaza, the Philistines put Samson into the prison house, where he pushed a grinding wheel for their grain. Samson seems to have been an extremely self-assured person. He appears to have been very naive to continue to trust Delilah after repeated betrayals at her hand, and telling her all that was in his heart. As he saw it, the source of his strength was in the fact that a razor had never touched his hair, which was one of the terms of his Nazirite vow. He thought that the keeping of the vow was what gave him strength. Now, he had violated other terms of the vow already in his life. The cutting of the hair was probably the only part of the vow to which he had been true. Well, why would this particular term of the vow be his source of strength? Really, the strength was not in the long hair. His strength had been from the Lord, and Samson lost his strength when the Lord departed from him. This truth becomes even clearer when we look at Samson in the prison house. While he was pushing the grinding wheel, the hair of his head began to grow again. Once his hair began to grow back, what happened to Samson? He continued as a slave. As he rested in the lap of his betrayer, Samson shared what he thought was the secret of his strength. When Samson was standing in the temple of Dagon, he called upon God. He addressed the true source of his strength. Only when Samson's strength was gone did he feel the need for God. As a result of calling upon God, he was filled with strength one more time. And he was able to push down the pillars of the temple, and the temple came down, killing everyone in it. He killed more in his death than he had in his life. This last surge of strength was given to Samson from his true source of strength all along. It's tragic that Samson had to die in the process of discovering the source of his strength. Samson had a hard time learning this lesson. He met his death while he learned the true source of his abilities. As we look at the life of Samson, though, it's not all negative. We see in his life a partial surrender. As Samson stood with his hands stretched between the pillars of the temple of Dagon, he asked God for the ability to perform that one last feat of strength. Instead of being a scene of victory for God's deliverer, however, this is a depressing scene which reminds us of what might have been. Think what Samson could have accomplished with his life had he been totally dedicated to God all the days of his life. Samson was meant to deliver God's people from Philistine oppression, but the task was more than his limited faith could conceive. While we think of Samson, our minds naturally go to the amazing feats of strength that he performed. But the story of Samson is also a story of weakness. If Samson had been as strong in character as he was in physical prowess, he would have stood as one of God's all-time great champions. He was selfish at times in the way that he used his God-given gifts. He failed to see the true source of his strength until the last of his life. He failed in completely dedicating himself to God until the last moment of his life. And these weaknesses prevented Samson from being the great man of God he was intended to be. Well, despite all of Samson's shortcomings, it's interesting that he makes Hebrews chapter 11. Just a brief mention. He's there after the others have been described in a little bit of detail. But he's pictured as a hero of the faith. He had a faith that came back. God used Samson despite Samson's faults. And isn't that the case with all of us? None of us are perfect. God uses imperfect people because there are no other kind to use. But if we will allow God to work in our lives, He will use us for His glory. After toiling over a 1,000-piece puzzle, a woman was unable to finish it because one piece was missing. She returned the box to the store and explained why. The clerk was obviously not a puzzle enthusiast. As she refunded the woman's money, she asked pleasantly, "How far did you get before you realized there was a piece missing?" When do you realize a piece is missing from a jigsaw puzzle? When the puzzle is almost done. You spent all that time working on the puzzle, but it isn't until it's too late that you notice that a piece is gone. Well, Samson was a man who had lost something as well, and he didn't seem to notice it was missing until it was too late. His strength had been taken from him, and he faced bondage and blindness because it was now gone. Yes, Samson was a weak, strong man. We must always remember the importance of spiritual strength, and that spiritual strength